File number 975306 in the holdings of the Central Archive of the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation contains 3 folders of documents with a total volume of 742 sheets. On yellowish paper of the 30th format, the final inspection report of a special facility of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs in the settlement of Barbish, Kuibyshev Oblast, is recorded. The document specifies the exact geographical coordinates of the execution site, the model of the firearms used, the caliber of the ammunition, and the signatures of the executors from the special group of the administration of the Commandant of the Administrative Economic Directorate of the NKVD of the USSR. Sheet number 142 contains Directive number 2756/B, dispatched by courier from Moscow to Kuibyshev on October 18, 1941. The document bears a resolution ordering the physical liquidation of 25 individuals from among the former High Command of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army and the Air Forces. The procedure was carried out without a court decision, based on a special order from an extrajudicial body. This document recorded the cessation of an entire management structure that had been formulating the doctrine for the application of Soviet aviation in the pre-war period. Before we proceed to a detailed reconstruction of the logistical processes, operational plans, and archival documents of this case, the channel's authors ask you to subscribe to our resource. Your subscription, comments, and likes enable us to continue working with primary sources, pay for archive requests, and create in-depth documentary research. Support the channel's development so you don't miss new analytical materials. To understand the preconditions of the management crisis in the Air Forces, it is necessary to analyze the material technical state of Soviet aviation at the turn of 1940 and 1941. According to a report by the Main Directorate of the Red Army Air Forces on the state of materiel, as of January 1, 1941, the listed aircraft inventory numbered 26,312 units of all types. Of these, less than 15% were categorized as modern first-line combat aircraft. The backbone of fighter aviation consisted of I-16 aircraft of various modifications, including types 10, 17, 24, 28, and 29, as well as the maneuverable I-153 Chaika fighters. The combined share of these types in the fighter aviation regiments of the border districts was 78.4%. The technical characteristics of these aircraft were significantly inferior to the enemy's primary fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 models E and F. The speed of older Soviet fighter types was 70 to 120 kilometers per hour lower than that of German machines. The second salvo of onboard armament on Soviet aircraft was 1.8 times lower. The economic potential of the USSR aviation industry in 1940 allowed for the production of up to 30 aircraft per day. However, the rearmament process encountered a systemic crisis in related industries. Production of the AM-35A liquid-cooled engines for the MiG-3 fighters at Plant Number 24 in Moscow and the M-105P engines for the Yak-1 and Lag-3 fighters at Plant Number 26 in Rybinsk was delayed. The cause was a shortage of high-quality alloy steels, as well as a lack of imported automatic machines for grinding crankshafts. As of March 1, 1941, 3 leading aircraft plants, including Plant Number 1 in Moscow, Plant Number 21 in Gorky, and Plant Number 115, had failed to meet the delivery plan for new machines by 42%. The main reason was a high level of defects in casting and the wooden wing structures. The LAG-3 aircraft, which had a Delta wood construction, had an excess weight of 250 kilograms above the design weight due to violations in the technology of impregnating the veneer with resins of the VIAM-B3 brand. The logistics of aviation fuel supply in the border military districts by May 1941 were in a critical state. The Air Force's demand for high-octane gasoline grades B-78 and B-100 was being met by current production by only 62%. The strategic reserve, concentrated at the bases of the Volga and North Caucasus military districts, could not be promptly delivered to the western regions due to the low carrying capacity of the railways. The standard turnaround time for tank cars on the 1,524 mm gauge was 12 days instead of the planned 6 days. At the airfields of the Western Special Military District, the fuel stockpile ensured no more than 3 to 5 days of intensive combat operations, based on a norm of 2 sorties per aircraft per day. As of May 1, 1941, the planned indicators for equipping aviation units with new types of aircraft were 4,500 units. The actual number was 1,840 units. This corresponded to only 40.8% of the planned level. The supply of high-octane gasoline reached 74,400 tons against a plan of 120,000 tons. This constituted 62% of the normative requirement. The planned average annual flight time per pilot was supposed to be 120 hours. The actual flight time did not exceed 42 hours. This was 35% of the norm. The share of serviceable aircraft was 71.3% against a normative indicator of 92%. This meant the plan was fulfilled by 77.5%. The entire system of personnel recruitment and training was functioning under conditions of severe resource shortages. The high accident rate became a key trigger for the initiation of personnel purges. According to data from the Special Department of the Main Directorate of State Security of the NKVD of the USSR, between January 1st and April 10, 1941, 121 catastrophes and 324 accidents occurred in aviation units, leading to the loss of aircraft and the lives of flight crews. The accident rate coefficient was 3.4 incidents per every 1,000 flight hours, which was the highest indicator among all branches of the military. Official reports cited design flaws of the aircraft, low quality of factory assembly, and an unsatisfactory level of pilot training as the main causes of accidents. Flight schools were graduating cadets with a total flight time of 12 to 15 hours, of which time on modern aircraft types did not exceed 3 hours. Pilots did not possess the skills for blind flying or group formation flying in complex meteorological conditions. On April 9, 1941, at a meeting of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, a report was heard from the Chief of the Main Directorate of the Air Force, Lieutenant General of Aviation Pavel Vasilyevich Rychagov. According to the meeting transcript, Rychagov sharply pointed out that the high accident rate was directly linked to the industry's forced production of unfinished aircraft, which he called flying coffins. The reaction of the High Command was immediate. On April 12, 1941, the decree of the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR and the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, on the liquidation of accidents and catastrophes in the aviation of the Red Army was issued. By this document, Rychagov was relieved of his duties as Chief of the Air Force, with the justification of unsatisfactory leadership and indiscipline. He was replaced by Lieutenant General of Aviation Zhigarev. Simultaneously, the deployment of a large-scale investigative case began, which received the name the Aviators Affair in NKVD operational summaries. The chronicle of investigative actions and arrests of the High Command unfolded according to a strict schedule set by the state security organs. Operational development was conducted by the 3rd Directorate of the People's Commissariat of Defense, jointly with the 3rd Directorate of the NKVD of the USSR. The charges were based on testimony obtained during the 1937 to 1939 investigations, as well as new intelligence reports about the existence of a military fascist conspiracy and sabotage activities within the system of the main Directorate of the Air Force and the People's Commissariat of the aviation industry. A special NKVD report, numbered 224/B, dated May 15, 1941, indicated that the submitted intelligence material documented the organized resistance of a group of high-ranking Air Force officers to the introduction of new aircraft types. Instances of deliberate understatement of tactical and technical requirements for the Yak-1 and MiG-3 aircraft by the leadership of the main Directorate of Air Force orders were recorded, which led to delays in their serial production. The first wave of arrests began in late May 1941. On May 31st, Colonel General Alexander Dmitrievich Loktionov was taken into custody. He had held the post of commander of the troops of the Baltic Special Military District until December 1940, and prior to that, was head of the Air Force of the Red Army. The arrest was carried out at the railway station in the city of Riga by operatives of the local NKGB administration. Loktionov was immediately transported to Moscow and placed in the internal prison of the NKVD on Lubyanka. He was charged with creating a counter-revolutionary organization within the district's troops and sabotaging defensive construction on the new border. Investigative actions against Loktionov were conducted continuously during the first weeks after his detention. On June 7, 1941, an NKVD operational group led by State Security Major Vlodzimirsky conducted the arrest of Colonel General Grigory Mikhailovich Stern. At the time of his arrest, Stern held the position of head of the main Directorate of Air Defense of the USSR. His military biography included leading combat operations at Lake Khasan, commanding a frontline group at the Khalkhin-Gol River, and commanding the 8th Army during the Soviet-Finnish War. Stern held the status of Hero of the Soviet Union. The charges were based on the assertion that he had been a participant in the conspiracy since 1938 and had deliberately weakened the air defense systems of Moscow and Leningrad by delaying the deployment of RUS-2 Redoute radar stations and 85mm anti-aircraft guns. On June 8, 1941, Aviation Lieutenant General Yakov Vladimirovich Smushkevich was arrested in the hospital where he was undergoing treatment after a severe aviation accident that resulted in the amputation of both his legs. Smushkevich was the assistant to the head of the General Staff of the Red Army for Aviation, a twice Hero of the Soviet Union and a key organizer of the Soviet Aviation Group in Spain and at Khalkhin-Gol. Due to the physical condition of the detainee, his transport was carried out on a sanitary stretcher under the escort of 4 officers from the internal prison. Smushkevich was accused of heading a conspiratorial organization within the Air Force, blocking the development of attack aviation and creating conditions for a high accident rate. On June 24, 1941, on the 3rd day after the start of hostilities between the USSR and Germany, followed the arrest of Pavel Vasilyevich Rychagov. His wife, Deputy Squadron Commander Major Maria Petrovna Nestorenko, was arrested along with him. On the same day, Aviation Lieutenant General Arzhenukin, head of the Air Force Command and Navigator Academy, Aviation Major General Volodin, former Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and Engineer Aviation Service Major General Sacrier, Deputy Head of the Main Directorate of Air Force Supply, were isolated from command. Within 3 weeks, the entire upper management vertical responsible for the planning, supply, training, and deployment of Soviet aviation had been taken into custody. On June 27, 1941, Aviation Lieutenant General Ivan Yosifovich Proskurov, a hero of the Soviet Union, formerly head of the main intelligence directorate of the General Staff and later commander of the air forces of several military districts, was detained. He was accused of intentionally distorting intelligence data about the potential of the Luftwaffe. Following him, Aviation Major General Pampur, commander of the air forces of the Moscow Military District, Aviation Major General Levin, Chief of Staff of the air forces of the same district, Filip Filipovich Filin, a first-rank military engineer and head of the Air Force's Scientific Testing Institute, and a prominent specialist in aviation armament, Artillery Major General Kayukov, were taken into custody. The arrests also affected Deputy Head of the Main Artillery Directorate, Major General Savchenko, and Head of the Defense Construction Directorate, Sklitskov. The total number of arrested senior leaders of the Air Forces and related directorates by early July reached 30 people. The investigative process from June to October 1941 took place against the backdrop of a rapidly deteriorating situation at the front. The suspects were held in Lefortovo and Sukhanovka prisons, where methods of physical coercion sanctioned by the NKVD leadership were applied to them. The first archival discrepancy is revealed when comparing the interrogation protocols of Colonel General Loktionov with the logs of investigative actions. The protocol dated July 7, 1941, records Loktionov's full admission of guilt in participating in an anti-Soviet conspiracy. However, the ledger for issuing personal files and the medical journals of the internal prison show that no interrogation was conducted on that day because the suspect was in a state of complete physical incapacity. The signature on the protocol shows pronounced deformities that do not match the graphical appearance of Loktionov's signature on pre-war orders. Analysis of the ink reveals the use of different types of dye for the text of the protocol and for the signature, indicating the document was fabricated after the fact without the actual participation of the suspect. This fact points to a crude falsification of the evidence base by the investigative group under the leadership of the assistant head of the investigative unit for especially important cases of the NKVD. The second strategic error in planning and analysis by the investigation was the accusation against Generals Smushkevich and Rychagov of intentionally sabotaging the program for dispersing aircraft at border airfields. The case materials assert that the suspects ordered the concentration of 60 to 80 aircraft on a single airfield within 20 to 30 kilometers of the state border, which led to their destruction by German aviation in the first hours of the war. However, operational strategic documents of the General Staff, specifically the 1941 State Border Defense Plan, known under the code MP41, show that the deployment of regiments was approved directly by the main operational directorate of the General Staff and personally by the People's Commissar of Defense. The throughput capacity of unpaved airfields in the zone of the Western Special Military District physically did not allow for dispersal. The engineering preparation of one runway required 45 days and up to 3,000 tons of gravel-sand mixture. The People's Commissariat of Defense allocated only 12% of the required number of construction battalions. The investigation ignored this topographical and engineering factor, shifting responsibility from a systemic failure of state mobilization to specific executives in the Air Force's headquarters. The third procedural and logistical anomaly was recorded between the 12th and 15th of October 1941. In connection with the approach of German troops to Moscow and the declaration of a state of siege, the evacuation of the central apparatus of the NKVD and the special contingent began. The prisoners of the aviators case were loaded into a special prison railway car, ZAK, at the Moscow-Tovarnaya station of the Kursk Railway. The route was designated to the station of Kuibyshev. According to Waybill number 441/OP, the car moved as part of a convoy with low priority. The travel time was 96 hours. In doing so, the conditions of transport violated internal NKVD Circular number 00114 of 1939 on the rules for transporting high-ranking command personnel. The detainees were held in conditions of extreme overcrowding, without hot meals or medical assistance. Twice, hero of the Soviet Union, Smushkevich, whose surgical stitches on his legs had opened, did not receive antiseptic treatment for his wounds throughout the entire journey. This led to the development of a purulent infection. The transportation of seriously ill prisoners without recording their medical status in the travel logs made it impossible to conduct further investigative actions upon arrival in Kuibyshev. This forced the investigation to transition to an extrajudicial liquidation procedure. A critical audit of the command's decisions and the actions of the state security organs must be conducted through the prism of the Criminal Procedure Code of the RSFSR 1926 edition and the Statute on Military Crimes, which were in effect at the time. Article 58, paragraphs 1b, providing for liability for treason by military personnel, paragraph 7, sabotage, and paragraph 11, counter-revolutionary organizational activity, required the mandatory conduct of an open or closed judicial session of the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR. However, by mid-October 1941, the legal framework for the functioning of state institutions had undergone radical changes. On the 17th of October 1941, People's Commissar of Internal Affairs, Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria, sent a memorandum numbered 2756/B to the chairman of the State Defense Committee, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. The text of the document stated that, due to the evacuation of the investigative unit to Kuibyshev and the impossibility of ensuring a proper detention regime and continuing the investigation for a number of arrested individuals under investigation for participation in a military fascist conspiracy, it was advisable to apply the supreme penalty to them without a judicial hearing. An approving resolution was recorded on the memorandum. This decision completely removed the procedure from the framework of Soviet procedural law, replacing a judicial verdict with an administrative order. From the point of view of the military regulations of the Red Army, in particular the Provisional Field Regulations of 1939, known as PU 39, the arrest and subsequent elimination of the top echelon of Air Force Command during a strategic-scale defensive operation dealt a critical blow to the stability of troop communications and coordination. The regulations required continuous management of aviation formations by the Air Force main staff. The removal of key generals resulted in newly appointed officers lacking operational experience in managing large air forces and being unfamiliar with the actual situation on the ground. During the Vyazma defensive operation in October 1941, the Air Force headquarters of the Western Front lost wired communication with 75% of its subordinate regiments. This occurred due to the absence of a pre-prepared redundant radio communication system, the development of which had been halted after the arrest of the Chief of the Air Force Staff, Volodin. The officers appointed to replace the arrested specialists used open communication channels, which allowed Wehrmacht radio intelligence to promptly identify the coordinates of Soviet airfields and launch preemptive strikes against them. On October 28, 1941, at 2:40 local time, on the territory of a special NKVD facility located in the suburban area of the city of Kuibyshev, near the settlement of Barbish, a group of employees from the Commandant's department began to carry out an order. The procedure was conducted in batches of 4 persons. Physical liquidation was carried out by means of standard 7.62 mm TT pistols. The entire procedure took 1 hour and 15 minutes. Among those liquidated that day were Aviation Lieutenant General Yakov Vladimirovich Smushkevich, former assistant to the Chief of the General Staff of the Red Army; Aviation Lieutenant General Pavel Vasilyevich Rychagov, former head of the Main Directorate of the Red Army Air Force; Colonel General Alexander Dmitrievich Loktionov, former commander of the troops of the Baltic Special Military District; and Colonel General Grigory Mikhailovich Stern, former head of the Main Directorate of Air Defense of the People's Commissariat of Defense of the USSR. Also liquidated in this same special operation were Aviation Lieutenant General Fyodor Konstantinovich Arzhenukin, former head of the Air Force Military Academy; Aviation Lieutenant General Ivan Yosifovich Proskurov, former head of the Main Intelligence Directorate of the General Staff; Aviation Major General Pavel Semyonovich Volodin, former Chief of Staff of the Air Force; Engineer Aviation Service Major General Ivan Filimonovich Sakrier; and Deputy Air Regiment Commander Major Maria Petrovna Nestorenko. The bodies of the liquidated officers were buried in previously prepared trenches on the facility's territory. The earthen cover was leveled and camouflaged with a layer of sod and branches. The burial report, compiled by Senior Lieutenant of State Security Kashtanov, states that all external signs of the burial were completely eliminated, and the territory was placed under round-the-clock guard by an NKVD militarized rifle squad. Relatives of the liquidated persons were not informed of the execution of the sentence. In the special contingent registration files, a note was made, "Departed under the first category." The material, technical, and operational consequences of this personnel purge manifested with maximum severity during the Battle for Moscow. By the start of the German offensive under Operation Typhoon on September 30, 1941, the aviation grouping of Soviet troops on the western direction numbered 1,388 aircraft, of which only 768 were serviceable. The majority of the equipment had been lost in the border battles due to the disorganization of rear services and lack of management, which were a direct consequence of the arrest of Sakrier and his subordinates in the Main Directorate of Air Force Supply. The new commanders did not know the locations of the field depots of the People's Commissariat of the Oil Industry, leading to the abandonment of over 40,000 tons of aviation fuel to the enemy at supply depots near Smolensk and Orsha. Aircraft were forced to make flights to rear bases without combat loads due to the absence of Schwach aircraft cannons and shells for them at forward basing points. The destruction of the Air Force elite led to a degradation of tactical thought, Instead of the massive application of air divisions on the axes of the main strikes by German tank pincers, Soviet aviation in October 1941 was used in small groups of 3 to 9 aircraft. Such dispersal of forces could not stop the advance of the 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups of the Wehrmacht. Coordination between the fighter aviation of Moscow's air defense, represented by the 6th Fighter Aviation Corps, and the front-line aviation of the Western Front was absent. 14 instances of firing on one's own aircraft were recorded due to the non-functioning identification friend or foe system, the specifications of which had been changed before the war. But instructions had not been disseminated to line units following the arrest of the developers from the Intelligence Directorate. The official report of the commander of the Western Front Air Force, dated November 12, 1941, indicated that the effectiveness of assault strikes against enemy columns remained at an extremely low level. The flight crews of arriving reinforcements are not trained in the tactics of suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Ground control of the regiments is absent due to a shortage of 5 AK-type radio stations. The command staff of the divisions, appointed from among squadron commanders, is failing to organize cooperation with the ground armies. The dry statistical outcome of the October events shows that the Soviet air forces lost 4 former heads of the department, 3 chiefs of staff and directorates, as well as more than 20 leading military engineers. The process of restoring the professional management echelon took the Red Army more than a year and a half, until the spring of 1943, when new tactics for employing air armies were developed during the aerial battles over Kuban. The material damage from the loss of experienced personnel cannot be compensated for by increasing aircraft production at the factories. Historical documents confirm that the liquidation of senior officers in October 1941 was not a judicial process, but an act of extrajudicial administrative reprisal carried out under conditions of panic and a systemic crisis of the state apparatus. All persons liquidated at the Barbish facility on October 28, 1941, were fully rehabilitated by the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR between 1954 and 1957 due to the absence of any criminal offense in their actions. This research relies exclusively on verified archival sources, free from the ideological and evaluative distortions of the post-war period. Consolidated data from investigative cases remains an object of further study within the framework of integrating the archival holdings of the Ministry of Defense and state security agencies. For a detailed analysis of the personnel deficit and operational vacuum that arose in the Air Force headquarters in the autumn of 1941, it is necessary to trace the chain of command replacement at the level of front directorates. Following the isolation of General Volodin, the duties of Chief of Staff of the Air Forces passed to officers lacking experience in strategic planning. This led to the failure to execute Stavka Directive number 002305 on the regrouping of reserve air regiments to the Mozhaisk defense line. Between the 5th and 10th of October 1941, out of 43 arriving trains with aviation equipment, 32 were unloaded at stations already within the artillery fire zone of the enemy's forward detachments. The Air Force Logistics Service, deprived of centralized leadership from the arrested General Sacrier, was unable to redirect transport flows. This resulted in the loss of materiel from 19 air regiments before they were even operationally subordinated to the front headquarters. Aircraft remained without engines, as the spare M105P engine kits had been sent to intermediate depots in Vyazma, where they were blocked by German tank units. The management crisis also affected the air defense system. Following the removal from the leadership structure of Colonel General Stern, the main Directorate of Air Defense of the USSR NKO, People's Commissariat of Defense, effectively lost control over the coordination of anti-aircraft artillery and fighter aviation actions within the boundaries of the Moscow Corps Air Defense District. Reports from the Air Defense Sector headquarters dated October 14, 1941, indicate that batteries of 85mm guns opened barrage fire at altitudes from 3,000 to 4,000 meters, without coordination with the flight schedules of MiG-3 fighters from the 6th Fighter Aviation Corps. This led to the loss of 7 Soviet aircraft that were intercepting German Junkers Ju-88 bombers in the Kubinka area. The absence of unified technical leadership and the halted deployment of RUS-2 radio detection stations, for which Stern was blamed, deprived the command of the ability to detect targets on the distant approaches to the capital in a timely manner. Alerting the air observation warning and communication posts was conducted based on visual and audio signals with a delay of 15 to 20 minutes, which nullified the tactical advantage of new-type high-speed fighters. The training program for flight personnel, for which the arrested Lieutenant General Arzhenukin was responsible, underwent a forced reorganization in October 1941 that bordered on the liquidation of training standards. The Military Academy of Air Force Command and Navigator Staff was evacuated to Chkalov under conditions of a lost training and material base. Senior year cadets were graduated early without taking state exams and were assigned to assault and bomber regiments, which were suffering the heaviest losses. Statistics from the main Directorate for Formation and Manning of the RKKA troops indicate that the average life expectancy of an assault pilot arriving at the Western Front in October 1941 did not exceed 11 combat sorties. The reason for such high losses was the complete absence of anti-aircraft evasion skills. Officers were not trained in the tactical methods of attack by Il-2 assault aircraft from low altitudes, which were being developed at the Air Force Scientific Testing Institute under the direction of military engineer Phelan prior to his arrest. The methodological instructions for the combat use of Il-2 aircraft remained at the testing range in Chkalovskaya in draft form, and were not reproduced by printing. Line pilots were forced to learn assault techniques through trial and error directly in the engagement zone of German 20mm Flak 38 anti-aircraft guns. The NKVD investigative organs in Kuibyshev, while working with the evacuated case files of aviators, encountered a systemic contradiction between the content of interrogation protocols and the real situation at the factories of the People's Commissariat of the aviation industry. The indictment of Major General of the Aviation Engineering Service Sakrier alleged that he deliberately delayed the introduction of 20mm Shvak automatic cannons into serial production on fighter aircraft. This allegedly reduced the firepower of Soviet aviation in the face of the Luftwaffe. However, an analysis of the order logs of the main Directorate of Air Force Supply shows that Sakrier repeatedly sent reports to People's Commissar Shakurin demanding a halt to the shipment of cannons from the Kovrov Plant No. 2 due to a catastrophic percentage of defects in the reloading mechanism. In September 1941, out of every 100 cannons supplied, 42 jammed after the first burst of 5 shots. Sakrier attempted to prevent the shipment of knowingly faulty weaponry to the front, which the investigation classified as sabotage and wrecking. The removal of Sakrier led to a drop in the quality control of incoming weaponry. In October 1941, the fighter regiments of the Western Front received 120 Yak-1 aircraft whose Schwevake cannons had a defective feed spring, making it impossible to fire in sub-zero temperatures. The pilots were forced to engage in aerial combat, armed only with two 7.62mm Schkaz machine guns. This reduced the weight of their fire per second to a critically low level of 0.8 kilograms. A similar situation occurred with the case of Lieutenant General Proskurov. As the former head of the main intelligence directorate, he was accused of concealing data about the deployment of German aviation corps at airfields in Poland and East Prussia in May to June 1941. Archival materials from the GRU, declassified in later periods, completely refute these accusations. In Proskurov's reports to the Chief of the General Staff, dated June 3rd, 11th, and 16th, 1941, the movement of the headquarters of the Luftwaffe's 2nd Air Fleet under the command of General Feldmarschall Kesselring to the Warsaw area is indicated with precision down to the group level. Proskurov recorded the arrival of specialized night flight support teams and the accumulation of aviation fuel reserves at forward operating bases in Biała Podlaska and Suwałki. This data was ignored by the country's top political leadership, which considered the information to be disinformation aimed at provoking a military conflict. The NKVD investigative team used the very fact of Proskurov's accurate forecast as proof of his connections with foreign intelligence agencies. The investigators argued that such detailed information could only have been obtained as part of a coordinated game with the enemy's special services. This distortion of intelligence analytical work destroyed trust in any subsequent intelligence reports coming from behind enemy lines in the autumn of 1941. The new heads of intelligence agencies, fearing a repetition of Proskurov's fate, compiled their reports in the most vague terms possible. This deprived the Western Front Command of accurate data on the directions of the attacks by Guderian's and Hoth's tank formations at the start of Operation Typhoon. The process of evacuating defense plants from Moscow in October 1941 exacerbated the logistical crisis caused by the loss of managerial personnel. Factory Number 1, named after Stalin, which produced MiG-3 fighters, began dismantling its equipment on October 10th. The machine tools were loaded onto open platforms and sent to Kuibyshev. Within 40 days, the production of these aircraft was completely halted. During this same period, Moscow's air defense fighter aviation lost 214 MiG-3 aircraft due to combat and technical reasons. It was impossible to replenish these losses with new supplies. The remaining aircraft in service had no spare parts. The previously arrested military engineer Phelan had been developing a protocol for the interchangeability of components between the MiG-3 and Yak-1 aircraft. But after his isolation, this work was discontinued. The technical staff at the Vnukovo, Chkalovskaya, and Ramenskoye airfields began cannibalizing damaged aircraft to keep the others in combat-ready condition. This reduced the available fleet of serviceable fighters to just 40 units by October 20th. Moscow was left virtually without high-altitude fighter cover. German Junkers Ju-86 reconnaissance aircraft gained the ability to conduct aerial photography of the city's defensive lines from altitudes above 9,000 meters without hindrance, as Soviet anti-aircraft batteries could not reach that ceiling, and the older I-16 fighters lacked the necessary altitude capability and oxygen equipment. A logistical collapse at the key stations of the Moscow railway junction in mid-October 1941 blocked the dispatch to the front of trains carrying aviation armaments and ammunition. At the Perovo and Lublino stations, more than 200 wagons with FAB-100 and FAB-250 aerial bombs arriving from Gorky had accumulated. Due to a lack of coordination between the Air Force Transport Directorate and the People's Commissariat of Railways, these trains were abandoned without locomotives. At the same time, assault regiments at forward airfields in the Volokolamsk and Mozhaisk areas were conducting sorties carrying only small fragmentation bombs of the AO-25 type under their wings. This did not allow for the effective destruction of medium German T-3 and T-4 tanks. Regiment commanders sent panicked radiograms to the front headquarters demanding the supply of high-explosive bombs, but the orders stalled at the paperwork level of the Front Air Force headquarters, where the personnel had been renewed by 80% after a wave of arrests. The new staff did not have the access codes to the secret special-purpose warehouses of the Mobilization Directorate, which paralyzed the issuance of ammunition from the warehouses in Noginsk and Mytishchi. An analysis of documents from the Kuibyshev Regional Prosecutor's Office and archival materials of the Kuibyshev Region KGB Directorate for 1954 allows for the reconstruction of the mechanism of legal rehabilitation of persons liquidated at the Barbish facility. During the investigation, initiated upon the application of Galina Yakovlevna Smushkevich, daughter of twice hero of the Soviet Union, all the original investigative case files were retrieved. The military prosecutor's office established that the case materials contained no objective evidence of espionage, sabotage, or other counter-revolutionary activity. All confessional statements of the accused were obtained with gross violations of legality. The prosecutorial audit showed that the accusations against Smushkevich of intentionally downplaying the combat capabilities of the IL-2 attack aircraft were refuted by his own pre-war memoranda addressed to the Defense Committee under the USSR Council of People's Commissars. In these documents, Smushkevich insisted on the immediate cessation of production of the obsolete Su-2 light bombers and the transfer of all capacities of Factory Number 18 in the Air Force to the production of armored attack aircraft. The prosecutor's office concluded that Smushkevich's activities were aimed at strengthening the country's defense capability, and his arrest and liquidation were the result of career intrigues and falsifications by the senior leadership of the NKVD. During the review of General Rychagov's case in 1954, testimony from surviving employees of aircraft factories and officers of the Air Force Main Directorate was heard. An expert commission under the leadership of Engineer Aviation Service Lieutenant General Repin established that Rychagov's statement about flying coffins fully reflected the real technical condition of the first series MiG-3 aircraft. On these machines, due to production defects at factory number 1, failures of the fuel transfer system regularly occurred, leading to engine stoppage during takeoff. Rychagov acted in strict accordance with the requirements of the RKKA disciplinary regulations, which obligated a commander to report the true state of affairs to his superior. The Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR, on May 11, 1954, overturned Beria's decision of October 17, 1941, regarding Rychagov, Smushkevich, Stern, Loktionov, and others, due to the absence of any criminal offense in their actions. All were posthumously restored to their military ranks and rights to state awards. Their names were returned to the official history of the Great Patriotic War. The overall outcome of the personnel crisis in the Red Army Air Force in 1941 demonstrates the profound interrelation between the state's repressive policies and operational technical failures on the front. The elimination of the top echelon of military specialists on the eve and at the beginning of a large-scale confrontation with a high-tech adversary led to a rupture in the continuity of military doctrine development. The experience gained by Soviet aviators in Spain, China, at Khalkhin Gol, and in Finland was virtually lost, as its bearers were physically eliminated or isolated from command positions. The new generation of Air Force leaders was forced to redevelop tactics for air combat, methods of interaction with ground forces, and principles for organizing aviation logistics. This learning process occurred under conditions of Luftwaffe air supremacy and was accompanied by the loss of thousands of aircraft and the lives of flight crews. The execution of generals in October 1941 marked the point of maximum weakening of the Soviet aviation's managerial potential, the consequences of which were only overcome after a fundamental restructuring of the entire armed forces command system during the campaigns of 1942 and 1943. This study documents the facts of this process, relying strictly on documentary evidence and the logic of historical events development, excluding any attempts at a political or moral evaluation of past decisions by modern researchers. The completion of work with the funds of the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense allows us to assert that the lessons of this managerial crisis remain a key element for understanding the specifics of the initial period of the war on the Soviet-German front.